Have you ever thought, is this just me when struggling to stay organized, start tasks, or manage time? For those of us over 50, these challenges might not be just aging. They could be ADHD hiding in plain sight for decades. I'm Jami Shapiro, host of Grandma Has ADHD, and I'm building a community where your experiences matter. Whether you're diagnosed, questioning, or simply curious, you're not alone. Our Facebook group is filled with vibrant, understanding people over 50 who share their stories, strategies, and yes, even their struggles, with plenty of laughter along the way. Ready to find your people? Join our growing Grandma Has ADHD Facebook community. Please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen and share it with someone who might need to hear they're not alone, because ADHD doesn't have an age limit and neither does understanding yourself better. Together, we're changing the conversation about ADHD after 50. Come be part of the story. Hi, and welcome to the latest edition of Grandma Has ADHD. I am here today with a very special guest that I got to meet at the International ADHD Conference. I had Elle O'Flaherty send me her bio prior to our chat. And as I shared with her, as is the case for most people that I interview who have ADHD and are in this space, her vita or her qualifications read off like, a very, very high achieving person, which is very typical for ADHD. They have a lot of degrees and professional appointment. I can't even think of the word. So I'm going to just give you the highlight, and then I'm going to let Elle O'Flaherty introduce herself and her business. So she actually is a JD and a professional coach. She's a keynote speaker, and she is the founder of Interlace Solutions Coaching. She specializes in the performance optimization ADHD strategies. I am like bumbling today, but I'm keeping it real. Like I tell everybody, she empowers professionals and organizations to excel. She's been featured in national media outlets, including Medium, Yahoo Finance, and Atlassian. I'm butchering it. She delivers research-backed insights and practical tools with humor to enhance productivity, leadership, and career growth. In her previous life, she was a litigator and an international trade negotiator. Whew, that's a lot. And welcome to Grandma Has ADHD. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our talk.
Me too. I really loved it when I met you at conference. And we have, as I share on the podcast, I try to keep my discovery call very short because I like to be as surprised as everybody else and keep the flow really natural. But I am also excited, in addition to her professional credentials and having ADHD herself, she is one of the first guests that I am bringing on who was raised by an ADHD mother. So I'm especially excited to hear about that.
Absolutely. Of course, we didn't know it at the time because in the 1980s in Virginia, women and girls, I like to say, were immune from ADHD. We could not get it as far as I can tell. So we found that out later. But yeah, it's been really interesting being raised by an ADHD mom and also being an ADHD mom, especially with the way that some of our ADHD traits go against the stereotype of what we expect women and girls, our roles to be, especially as moms. So yeah, that's really exciting. I'll look forward to talking about that too.
Sure. Okay. So take me back. I always like to ask everybody's origin story. And I never heard the word immune from ADHD. I might have to steal that one from you. So.
We didn't get clued in until past the 80s that women and girls absolutely can have ADHD.
Well, I want to give you a quick plug. So I was standing at the conference and, I've been sharing, and I'm new to the ADHD professional world, not new to ADHD. And I was sharing, that I'm doing this Grandma Has ADHD podcast, and somebody that hears me says, "Oh, you mean we're not going to outgrow it like everybody says?" So it's just like there's this whole misconception. And have you seen this magazine yet?
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, I was going to tell of our listeners, if you're not watching on YouTube and you are listening to the interview, I am holding a magazine that you can find on the newsstand until March 21st. It's called Very Well ADHD. It's a special edition. unless you're living under a rock, you are hearing about ADHD. It's all over TikTok. It's all over Facebook, all of the reels, and now in magazines on the newsstands. But nobody is discussing ADHD in seniors and that intersection. So it gives me even more passion, but not only to, alert people about what ADHD looks like in seniors, but also the ADHD community who needs to start thinking about one day they're going to be a senior with ADHD. So anyway, that's my little soapbox.
So I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And having neurodiverse parents and seeing that journey for them, my parents are almost in their 80s, and I've seen sort of everything from medical care down to, getting care and rehabilitation and all these sorts of things. It's such a huge impact. I mean, I talk to a lot of doctors and physicians conferences, and oftentimes I'll talk about the big picture of ADHD, but also down to the little details. Like, we have trouble with short-term memory. So when you are telling us things in a doctor's appointment, when we're probably already stressed, it's very likely we won't remember them. And seeing that compounded by being older and maybe having other memory challenges, it's just a really interesting lens that I think that we need to help, particularly healthcare, assisted living, all those kinds of folks to understand how that plays out. And of course, also people who are realizing that they have been ADHD all their lives. Mm-hmm. I have some clients who will realize it when their children or grandchildren are diagnosed. Mm-hmm. And I like to tell people that it's completely normal to go through a grieving process of what could have been, how you could have understood yourself, just lots and lots of different things. And I find that absolutely rings true as well for folks who are in their senior years and trying to help people understand their life through this new lens. It's really, really interesting. So there are a lot of pieces to it that I'm seeing.
Right. In fact, you brought up something with aging, and it is normal for even the neurotypical person to, even if they don't have dementia or, to have a cognitive decline. And so we need to start doing more universal design around that decline in our memory, whether you have ADHD or not. So I just wanted to kind of point that one out. But I want to go back and hear your backstory. How did you get here? So do you mind sharing?
No, of course. My villain origin story.
Villain.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
It was definitely not a direct route. I will say that. So I wasn't diagnosed until well into adulthood. And by then, I had been an attorney for almost 20 years. I had a career that on paper looks great. I was leading delegations and part of delegations to the World Trade Organization and to the United Nations. It was really interesting, meaty work. But in the day-to-day as an attorney doing these things, a lot of it was sitting in a room by myself reading very dense text. And that can be a challenge for anyone, but particularly with my version of my spicy brain. And so I started noticing what I really, really enjoyed. And outside of what we're supposed to enjoy, outside of what I call prestige pressure, where particularly a lot of my clients who are raised by white collar parents, they feel this pressure of what they should be doing, become a lawyer or a doctor or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And when I really started looking at what I actually genuinely enjoyed and wanted to do, a lot of it had to do with coaching my team and helping to develop people, teaching. Of course, this is very ADHD, but just as a side gig that I assigned myself, a colleague and I put together a 2-day training on everything you need to know about international trade to be a negotiator. And we started delivering this around the world. And it was one of the most rewarding things that I had done. And so I started looking into coaching and getting credentials, and it kind of evolved to where I opened my own firm, and we're worldwide. And also now I do a lot of speaking and training. And some of the things I focus on are certainly it's interesting because, again, I'm ADHD, right? So I got certified in 3 different kinds of coaching. And so I blend ADHD coaching, career coaching, and then also executive coaching. Not executive like executive function, but executive like, so you're a CEO, what comes now? And so I pull from all of that. And then I also do a lot of keynote speaking and training and all those sorts of things. And it's been great. The second half of my career has been such an exploration in what I actually enjoy and what really inspires me. And I kind of have beef with every high school guidance counselor ever, because at least when I was in high school, 150 years ago.
I'm sure you're younger than I am. I'll tell you, I graduated in 88.
I am not too much younger than you. But, they used to do these tests about saying, okay, where are your talents? What are you good at? Okay, go be that. But they never asked, and do you enjoy it? Which I think is such a critical question, because I'm a pretty good lawyer and trade negotiator, but I never want to do it again. And
Wow.
so that's one of the things that I ask a lot of my clients. We help to think about what they're good at, but more importantly, and what brings them joy and what inspires them. And so that's one of my big focuses in my work now, is trying to make people understand that joy and fun should not be disconnected from your professional self. And I think that unfortunately it has in a lot of ways.
Sure. Okay. So quickly take me back to you. How do you find you have ADHD, and then where do you go from there? I know you said you got a lot of coaching. Did you find out along the coaching journey?
I did. Yeah. I think I knew. I had a pretty solid, but much like a lot of adults, I had a pretty solid idea, but ADHD is so stigmatized. It was really hard for me to go ahead and take the step of getting diagnosed and admitting, if I can say that, to myself that I have ADHD.
So interestingly, I had no idea that I had ADHD, because back to your point, I thought it was just boys and you were hyperactive. So I didn't find out until my oldest child was diagnosed. So I've known for 9 years. So I found out in my mid-50s. Which they also say women find out when they start to see changes in their estrogen levels during perimenopause, because estrogen is so pregnant. But anyway, I'm not going to hijack the thing. I want to go back. I definitely want to explore having an ADHD mom with you, and also being that sandwich, because I'm in the same situation. I have an ADHD mom and dad, and 2 of my 3 children have ADHD.
Yeah, it can be hectic. It can definitely be a lot.
So go ahead. How old is your child or children?
My children are 8 and 12, and my parents, as I said, are right around 80. And it's definitely interesting, looking across the generations, because I'm Gen X, my parents are the silent generation / boomers, and my kids are whatever they're calling the kids now. And so looking across the generations.
Gen Z, and it's a Gen Alpha. I don't know. Okay. So go ahead.
I don't know either. I can't keep up. But looking across the generations and seeing the differences, like my kids don't see anything inherently bad or really negative about ADHD. I think they're starting to come online and unfortunately pick up some of those stigmas. But they have friends who are ADHD. It's a very normal thing. All the way up to my parents, who
do either of them,
to some extent. Oh, sorry.
I would say, do either of them have ADHD, or they're just learning?
They, one of them does. Yes. Okay. And it's interesting how it's just not as big a deal, as I said. Whereas in my parents, it's sort of like a generational thing where you don't want to admit that you have it, especially the silent generation. Like, everything's fine. We're fine.
We're silent. Exactly.
Yeah. And so I have hope for this next generation.
Okay. Sorry, we're seeming to have a lag in the conversation. I am going to take a pause, and I'm hoping that we can fix this. So if you guys will just hold tight, we're going to come right back. Ever wondered why helping a loved one declutter feels like speaking different languages? I did, especially with my mom. It wasn't until I founded Silver Linings Transitions, helping San Diego seniors organize and move for over a decade, that I discovered why. We all experience clutter differently. And for those of us with ADHD, it's a whole other world. If you are listening in the San Diego area and feeling stuck with moving, paperwork, photos, or home organization, our team at Silver Linings Transitions gets it. We understand ADHD's unique challenges, and we won't just help you get organized. We'll create sustainable systems that finally stick. Schedule a consultation with our team today at 760-522-1624. That's 760-522-1624, or find us at silverliningstransitions.com. And we are back with Elle O'Flaherty. We were talking about being in the middle. I did want to share with you, Elle, when I had a feeling that my youngest child had ADHD, I actually went on the internet and I looked up famous people with ADHD. And I wanted her to feel proud of it because, I'm not going to get into in this conversation the toxic positivity of ADHD or the negative part, but just like you can achieve whatever you want and we all have a different role in the world. So if, I'm glad to see that your children are learning about it. And if they ever have those feelings of shame, there's some amazing people in the world with ADHD. So we were talking when we took a break about, sort of what I wanted to cover. And Elle said, specifically women with ADHD and what society expects of them. And that is why it was so great for me to hear that you were raised by an ADHD mom. So share with me how you, now looking back with the 2020 vision, how you think having an ADHD parent maybe was different than having a neurotypical mom.
Well, I will say that to me, at least, it seems like the women's role in society, both, a generation ago and unfortunately still now, a lot of it has to do with the sort of executive function of the family, right? Mm-hmm. So we as women are expected to be the social secretary and respond to correspondence and keep the calendar. We're also expected to be the ones who keep the trains running on time. Mm-hmm. And literally all of those are hard for someone with ADHD. Mm-hmm. And so, I saw it in my mom with things like she had trouble with sort of sometimes connecting with other people socially and not as much for herself, but I think it was a little bit challenging with us as kids and sort of helping to make those connections. I think she was very overwhelmed because, of course, I was the latchkey generation. So she worked and so did my dad. And we really didn't have the same social infrastructure to support, not that it's great now by any means, but to support working moms. Mm-hmm. And so I think she was incredibly overwhelmed by trying to keep track of everything for work, everything for her family. And then if there was time, which there often wasn't, everything for herself. Mm-hmm. And now having experienced it also as a mom, the way I see it for myself is, as I said, for instance, if there's going to be an event or a play date or a birthday party, the other parent's going to reach out to the mom almost always. The school is going to reach out to the mom, all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm married to a nuclear engineer who is unbelievably on top of his game and really great at all those kinds of administrative things. Mm-hmm. And so I've turned over a lot of those traditional roles to my husband. He is very much our social secretary and he keeps the calendar and he makes the plane or the trains run on time.
Wow.
If I had to do any of that, we would never get anywhere. But it is interesting to see people's reactions.
Mm-hmm. I was going to tell you before I was diagnosed, I have 3 children. And I remember going to my now ex-husband and saying, I can't keep it together. I just can't get organized. And I also worked. Can you help me? And he was, no, that's on you. So, many reasons that he's my ex, but it's so great that we do need to change those roles of this is what, gender does. I have a non-binary child right now and really like shaking up gender norms for me and really looking at, just because I have these body parts doesn't mean this is what I'm good at or should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. And especially when we are on equal footing where both partners are working, it is insane to think that one should take over this entire role. And unfortunately for my generation, I think my husband is still a bit of a unicorn. And I see some people's husbands who do take over some of this role. And interestingly, I do see it more with my friends who have, neurological differences or disabilities because their husbands have to step up to the plate. Mm-hmm. But as we start to normalize this and as the school doesn't instantly call me instead of my husband or, different things like that, I think that it'll shift the burden a bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that and putting in place tools and skills that helps make this easier. So we aren't expected to be super parent or super whatever with everything in our head. And we start being able to offload some of these things either to automation or to some of, apps and tools and things that help. I'm really grateful for that.
Right. I think we're really lucky in that way. My audience, seniors, a lot of them are technologically challenged. Even for us getting onto this podcast today, And I didn't learn this until my ADHD coaching, that a lot of people with ADHD tend to have technological challenges because we don't want to go step A, step B, step C, step D. And so when we skip a step, inevitably, the cards are going to crumble. So tell me about, does your mom know that you think she has ADHD or that she has ADHD? Like where is that all falling?
She does. She has a formal diagnosis. She took medication for some time. What's interesting is that she had a formal medication and took medication and never told me. And so I didn't know until after I was diagnosed that she already had a diagnosis. And as many of us know, it's highly genetic. And so my reaction was, I was a little bit grumpy about it. I'm not going to lie. And I was like, that would be good information to know. And if it were something else, like if it were diabetes running in our family or whatever, of course you would tell your kids about that. So something that is equally as inheritable, to not share it with our kids, I was a little bit dumbfounded. But again, I think it goes back to that stigma, unfortunately.
Yes, they don't discuss it. So with my mom, my mother, I diagnosed my mother this past about a year ago, and I call her the original grandma for Grandma Has ADHD because I knew for 9 years that I had it. And my mother had seen a psychiatrist for depression and anxiety, which, very commonly occur with ADHD, had a physician, had a therapist, and nobody ever suggested that she had ADHD until I said, Mom, listen to this podcast. And then the light bulb, switch went on. And that was the backstory for this podcast, which is, you have a whole generation of people who don't even know they were skipped even more than we were skipped because, at least they were diagnosing ADHD in boys when we were growing up versus minimal brain dysfunction. And, so you've got people. And so for that, the fact that your mom even knew she had it is pretty amazing. How old was she when she figured it out or just, discovered it?
But she was well into past retirement. And I think she had a therapist who was cool and who got it, which I think is good. But yeah, I mean, especially for women, I think that the diagnostic criteria, it's usually a symptoms inventory, is hugely biased towards the sort of typical hyperactive 7-year-old boy bouncing off the walls, which less and less of us as we become adults are purely hyperactive type, and more of us are combined, like me, or inattentive type, which I really don't think that these tools capture as well. And unfortunately, I've come to realize from, again, speaking to these groups, therapists and doctors tell me that the entirety of their training on ADHD was about 15 to 20 minutes in school. And so when I present to these groups, their reaction is usually, wow, I didn't know any of that, which is a little concerning.
It really is. 1 in 5 memory care clinics only 1 in 5 are screening or asking questions about ADHD. And there are, false diagnoses out there. So yeah, I mean, we've got to get the word out. And also, when you have ADHD, and I'm sure you can relate to this, the times are now and not now. And so we're kind of slugging along in the moment that we're in, and we're not future planning. And I think that's going to really affect a lot of our generation and older as we are, going into retirement, if we can't even afford to retire, because unless we have a partner like you do, we may not have saved effectively and really planned for what is it going to look like when I can't work anymore and I maybe can't take medications, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up because I have a really big concern about that with our community, that a lot of my clients do have this spending challenges and that they spend without sort of thinking both in the near term and how it impacts their savings, but also when people retire. We tend to see sort of like time. We tend to see time as a big bucket. So we think, oh, we have plenty of time, just like we see our savings accounts or our retirement accounts. And so I do worry about people sort of blowing through those and not judiciously spending just because of the way our brains often work. And that's not true for all of us, certainly, but many of us.
Right.
So yeah, I do worry about that. I'm curious, when your mom found out just to go back, when your mom found out that you were naming a podcast after her and proclaiming it to the world, what was her reaction?
So that's a really good question. And nobody has asked me that. So initially, I actually, by trade, I am a senior move manager. So I started a company, Silver Linings Transitions, a little over 10 years ago. And we were going into seniors' homes when they were either moving to a smaller space or needing to get organized and handling the entire move for them. And I started doing a lot of speaking on, the downsizing, now we call it right sizing, getting organized. And so when I would speak, I would say that I came from a family with hoarding disorder, because if you had seen my mother's home, there were pieces of furniture that you couldn't see. She had things everywhere. And if you didn't know to distinguish it, you might have said that she had hoarding disorder. So I actually called her up. I said, Mom, I have some good news for you. You don't have hoarding disorder. I think you have ADHD. And initially, I actually had taken some pictures of her home, and I did not blast them on the internet, by the way. I was doing a presentation in San Diego. She is in Florida, but it turns out that someone that knew her saw these pictures and called her and said, your daughter is putting pictures of your house all over the internet. So my mom was outraged with me. I said, Mom, they're not all over the internet. I use them for a presentation because I wanted to explain to people, what does ADHD look like in seniors, and how do we distinguish ADHD from hoarding disorder, which I have a very good understanding of. And here's what I tell people, audience. And again, I'm not a doctor, but it's generally what I see is that somebody with hoarding disorder, if we want to go into their home and we want to start touching things, they're going to have a visceral reaction to it. It is so uncomfortable for them that they're going to resist, and it's going to be a bad experience. If I go to somebody whose home maybe looks very similar, and I will say my mom's is not as bad as what you would see, but if I said, hey, Mom, I'm going to come in and get your place organized, my mom would be like, good, when can you start? She's overwhelmed. She doesn't know where to begin. Because we tend to get super excited about something, my mom's a big crafter, so she will buy everything that she needs for the craft, and then she'll lose interest and move on to the next craft. That's part of it. Part of it is if you don't leave it out, you don't remember that you have it. So that's another part. And then the other part is, I'm so busy going from thing to thing to thing, or just doing what keeps me interested. My mom is a voracious reader, which is another reason I didn't think she had ADHD, because I have the combined type as well. I couldn't sit still to read, and my mom could sit and read for hours because that was what interested her. So that is a long answer to a short question. So she is accepted.
No, I love it.
And it's funny, I had her on, and I want to also say this. I always judged my mom. Like, I always was really frustrated because my mom is really, really smart, but she did not finish college, and she never finished anything. And I remember when I was in my 20s, giving my mom, who was in her 40s at the time, a round to it. It was like a little circle, a piece of paper that said TUIT, because my mom would always say, I'm going to get around to it. I'm going to do it one day. And I was so frustrated with my mom. And now that I realize that my mom had undiagnosed ADHD this whole time, I have a compassion for my mom that I have never had. And we are closer than we have ever been. And I think that makes her happy because she doesn't feel judged anymore. I'm like, oh, so she came to visit, and I'm leaving all the cabinets open. And she says, oh, that's what I do. So anyway, we did a post. I've discovered I have ADHD. What does my life look like? And she's actually coming to visit in a couple of weeks. And I said, Mom, I want to have you on the podcast again, so we can talk about, a year post diagnosis. What is that? And by the way, it's been confirmed by her psychiatrist, her therapist, and her doctor, and none of them caught it.
Mrs. Shapiro, I'm so happy for you. Welcome to the community.
She's not Shapiro. That's my ex-husband's name.
Well, that's your married name. Forgive me. I was just going to say one thing. As an ADHD coach, and of course, the goal of coaching is to get you from where you are to where you want to be. It's incredibly goal-oriented. And so a lot of what we do is helping ADHD people with tools and skills and systems and all that good stuff to get there. And it's a really normal thing for younger generations. I think as you climb up the generational ladder, people less and less understand or know about coaching. And so I do wonder a bit, like there are probably not as many people, nearly as many people getting diagnosed who are older or elderly. I wonder how many people are ever offered coaching or support to impact kind of how their ADHD characteristics, how to work with them and how to make them work for them. Has your mom ever done coaching or been approached about coaching?
I don't think so. And I'm really glad you brought that up too, because I remember when I came back from the international conference and my former mother-in-law said to me, why does it matter? And I'm like, so you're saying that when you become a senior, your life doesn't matter anymore? Like if you could put tools in place to make it better, why wouldn't you do that? So that's also, I'm saying this to ADHD coaches who aren't considering, this. I mean, when I went to conference, and if people have been listening to this podcast, they've heard me say it, but there were 2 sessions on aging with ADHD at a conference with more than 100 sessions. Like, we are not addressing it in our community. And, we need to for so many reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, every time there's a big life event or transition, like when we go to college or start the professional world, get married, have kids, all that good stuff, including when we retire, it tends to make our ADHD challenges flare.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding what's going on and how to work with that is so critical. And then also helping ADHD people transition, and frankly, everyone should have this help, but helping ADHD people transition into retirement and be fulfilled. Because the best advice I ever got about retirement was make sure that you have hobbies and things that you're really interested in place. Mm-hmm. Because once you retire, you don't want to just sit in front of the TV and sort of melt away. And for a lot of my clients who are very high achieving ADHDers, their job is their entire world. And when I ask them, so what do you do for fun outside your job? And they have no answer. Ooh. And some of them, as they're approaching retirement, I really worry what that transition is, sort of what the next years of their lives will look like.
Mm-hmm. So what would your advice be to somebody who is discovering that they have ADHD, whether they're a senior or,
Yeah. Well, I think the first one is to give yourself grace. It's, as I said, really normal to go through a grieving process. And I don't think that enough mental health professionals tell people that when they get diagnosed. So it can be really unexpected. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing is connect with the community, because one of the most powerful things that I do with my clients is saying, that's completely normal for us. Mm-hmm. And things that their entire life they've received extremely negative messages about. When I say, but that's totally normal for us, it's like the tension just leaves the room. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. I think everybody should go to an international ADHD conference and just be in a room full of people like you, because you just feel so validated and so like, oh, wow, these people are amazing.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So. The first one I went to, the first day, someone was walking around with like 5 cell phones going, did anyone lose a cell phone? And I was like, I'm home. I'm home.
It was the best. I felt like it was amazing. It was one of the best feelings I've ever had. And it is my people. And they're great. I mean, that's why when I was joking about reading your bio, I was like, well, of course she's this accomplished. And you said you're combined type as well, right?
I am. Yep. About 60% of us are. Yep.
Yeah. I've also got my ADHD. I'm working on my ADHD coaching. I'm a divorce coach. I've got a few things also. I didn't get my law degree, but
that was kind of an interesting combination there to see, because a lot of my clients, I help also with, just kind of by happenstance, I help with how ADHD is impacting their relationships and their marriages. It would be really interesting to help people who are going through divorce, and helping to some of my clients have a lot of shame and guilt over how they feel like they didn't show up for their partner. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how unwinding that might be helpful.
I have a podcast in my head already planned on the whole topic of divorce and ADHD. My father's been married 5 times. So.
Yeah, which is not that uncommon.
Right. So I interrupted you, and I apologize. It's, as you know, I have ADHD. So it's like, okay, she interrupted me. So I had asked you, when people find out what they should do, and you said find their community, which then spurred me into, the ADHD conference. What else? And then I want to find out how somebody who's listening to you, who should find you and how should they find you? So we need to make sure that we cover that as well, Elle.
Absolutely. The last thing that I was going to say is to get curious and find the tools and things that work with your brain. My one word of caution is anyone who is trying to shoehorn you into being neurotypical or to do things the way neurotypical people do, no, that is not going to work for you. That is unpleasant and impossible. Mm-hmm. And so looking for tools and things that are specifically made often by and certainly for ADHD people is really powerful. And that's when coaching comes into play. As far as how people reach me, my website is interlacesolutions.com. We only work with adults. We coach professionals from across their career, but particularly folks who are sort of mid and executive level. Our website has lots of information. I write a monthly newsletter that people are welcome to join. It gives you lots of free tips and interesting things. And then I do a lot of professional speaking. These days, I'm hired by a lot of companies to talk about ADHD, to talk about leadership. And my whole goal in this life is to reduce the stigma around ADHD. So pretty much anywhere I can do that, you'll find me.
That's awesome. Well, you and I are definitely aligned, only I'm extending that to helping seniors to realize that it isn't anything that should be stigmatized. None of us chose to have ADHD. It was what we were born with. And I always say you should actually feel proud because we were born with, I hate to use the word disability because there's so many gifts and advantages, but you have had to figure out without the tools that we are now, experiencing how to navigate life. And you did it, so I really applaud seniors. And I just wish that they would, that generation would embrace it and not be ashamed of it.
I love that. And if you don't mind me sharing one more thing, this is something that brings me a lot of joy. The National Institutes of Health did some modeling on early human groups. And it's such a fascinating research article, but it shows that having a small percentage of the population that has ADHD traits was actually critical for human survival. And the genes that we think are responsible for ADHD, it's DRD4, has been positively selected throughout all of human evolution. And so I absolutely do not see this as a disability. I see it as a difference and frankly, an important one. Unfortunately, when the Industrial Revolution came along and we sort of got stuck into cubicles and that sort of a thing, that's where we started having some trouble. But it's just really fascinating when you think of it that way, that it's a lot more like being left-handed. It's not a good or a bad thing, but the world was created for right-handed people. So we kind of have to figure out our own way of doing things.
I love that. You gave me chills. I want to end on something that I'm Jewish, not something I really talk about, but I remember a rabbi discussing that, that you could think of religions as a symphony, and that if we all played the same instrument, the music wouldn't sound as good. And that's exactly what you just said. So that is just pretty amazing. And I could go on and on about how wonderful the traits are, that we have. I am so grateful that you came on this podcast and that I got to meet you. Any final words before I, end the episode? We went a little longer, but it was so great. You had so much wisdom. And again, one of the only guests I've had so far that has an ADHD mom.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And you sound like you're a very smart rabbi, and absolutely. I love that you're reaching out to this population that's underserved. I think that folks who are older aren't getting nearly the information about ADHD, and especially the positive information that you're talking about. So you're doing the angel's work. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I love your smile too. Thank you. All right. Well, if you have listened, as you know, when I end this podcast, I truly believe that when you know that you have ADHD and you use it to your advantage, you really can make the rest of your life the best of your life. Thanks so much for listening. The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.